Welcome to this asynchronous cultural education learning module. I'm Aluk Edwardson, the cultural educator who put these modules together. I, like many others on this planet, am a multicultural person. I was raised in northern Alaska with one foot in my indigenous traditional community and one foot in the colonized world many of us live in today. For our purposes, colonization can be understood as the systemic abuse of power to benefit one group of people over another. This systemic abuse of power can be regarding land, subsistence rights, individual and communal sovereignty, spirituality, and access to clean water, air, and additional resources. Decolonization efforts support the unity of indigenous history, perspectives, art, science, and spirituality with indigenous people. Decolonization efforts can also encourage awareness and responsive action in people who primarily identify with their colonial heritage. Let's start our journey off with something very cultural indeed. Pictured is a young woman covered in colored dye enjoying Holi Festival in Jaipur, India. What is culture? Culture can be understood as the dynamic framework by which a society makes meaning, constitutes ways of being, and reproduces itself as a recognizable community. Culture, it turns out, is the way that every brain makes sense of the world. That is why everyone, regardless of race or ethnicity, has a culture. Think of culture as the brain's software for the brain's hardware. Culture is like the air we breathe, permeating all we do. And the hardest culture to examine is often our own. Because our own shapes our actions in ways that seem invisible and normal. Most social scientists today view culture as consisting primarily of the symbolic, ideational, and intangible aspects of human societies. The essence of a culture is not its artifacts, tools, or other tangible cultural elements, but how the members of the group interpret, use, and perceive them. It is the values, symbols, interpretations, and perspectives that distinguish one people from another in modernized societies. It is not material objects and other tangible aspects of human societies. People within a culture usually interpret the meaning of symbols, artifacts, and behaviors in the same or similar ways. Understanding cultural depth. Culture can be understood in reference to three distinct cultural layers. The first layer can be understood as surface culture. Surface culture includes things that you can see, hear, touch, or taste. Some of these things include food, flags, festivals, clothes, holidays, music, games, literature, language, and art. The second layer of culture can be understood as shallow culture. Shallow culture includes concepts of time, personal space, eye contact, ways of handling emotion, including reacting to and expressing emotion, nonverbal communication, how we raise children, thoughts on wellness and illness, and the tempo at which we each individually and as societies work. The third and last layer of culture can be understood as deep culture. Deep culture includes decision-making, concepts of the self, worldview, spirituality, notions of fairness or justice, a preference for competition or cooperation, your relationship to nature and animals, and definitions of kinship. Now we're going to take a moment to explore your cultural identity. This is a moment for reflection, journaling, introspection, and listening to yourself. Feel free to journal on paper or on the computer. Think through this in your mind or out loud. The questions I want you to think about are listed on the slide. The first is, what does the surface culture you were raised with look like? You can refer to slide 6 regarding cultural depth to reread what surface culture is if needed. Next, I'd like you to think about this question. What does the surface culture you live in now look like? Cultural archetypes represent different ways the brain organizes itself. There are a number of different cultural archetypes. We're going to focus on 2 that relate to cultural identity. The individualist cultural archetypes typically reflect Western ideals, and these ideals include being independent, self-reliant, achievement-oriented, competitive, assertive, pleasure-seeking, self-assured, direct, and guided by self-interest. The second cultural archetype we're going to look at today is called the collectivist cultural archetype, and these typically reflect Eastern ideals. These include being socially interdependent, connected, moderate or traditional, cooperative, obedient, self-sacrificing, sensitive, self-controlled, and equalitarian. There are more cultural archetypes than these 2. In reference to these 2 cultural archetypes, I invite you to further explore your cultural identity. Please respond to these questions, whether on paper, on the computer, or out loud. Were you raised in an individualist or collectivist culture? There is no right or wrong answer. Second question, what can you appreciate about the cultural archetype you were not raised with? What is creative decolonization? Creative decolonization involves the use of the creative process to create art and conversations that empower all people to embrace their multicultural heritage. That's all for this module, folks, but we invite you to explore other self-paced creative and cultural learning opportunities available at www.creativedecolonization.org.